Everyone, welcome back to our Mental Health Monday series. My name is Ameek and I'm one of the members at Brown Girl Health. And right before we are joined with a special guest, I'd like to say thank you so much for all the love and support we've gotten for Mental Health Mondays. It's just so important to have these conversations in the South Asian community, given that mental health is so stigmatized and it's no secret for that. Today we have Dr. Singh from Therapy for Brown Women joining us and talking to us about relationships and mental health. So I will let her join this live and we can start with a very amazing conversation regarding that. So let me let her join. All right. Hi, Dr. Singh.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being on our series. And I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today. Can you just tell us a little bit about like what you do and what's Therapy for Brown Women and like that whole page as well?
Sure. So, my name is Vijayeta Singh, and I'm a psychologist and I'm a speaker. And my mission with Therapy for Brown Women is really for it to be a place, an online community where women can, brown women, South Asian women, can and educate themselves about what relationships look like and the things that are important for us to keep in mind as we navigate our young adulthood and mostly our adulthood, because these are things that we don't really learn growing up, and we often come up with issues and problems as we're going through life. And so it felt like a natural place to start, as I see so many women who walk through the doors of my office talk about similar problems and issues. So it's really about learning to get ahead of the curve and understand these things so that we're not stumped by them.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so important, especially with the demographic for our page as well, is people starting to enter sorts of relationships or starting to get a lot more serious about them. So I guess my first question to you is what advice do you have for those who are new to all of this, like and are starting in their first relationships and all of that, especially with regards to mental health?
Yeah. So I think that one thing that I see very commonly in among people who are starting relationships, and especially people of color starting relationships, is I feel like especially in like South Asian communities, there's almost a stigma about being in relationships. So that's something that's discouraged. Our parents don't, want us to go to prom or like discourage us from being like sexually active, and are very, very concerned about that. And then we're suddenly thrown into the sea of being around other people and suddenly having to figure it out and navigate and now just be able to make do. And it seems like everybody has way more experience than we do and understands these things way more in a nuanced manner than we ever have. So I think first and foremost, it's important to be patient with ourselves, that if we have not had this experience, if we are slow to the whole relationship scene and situation, that it's okay, that this is really not a race, it's not a competition, there's no destination that we have to necessarily get to. So to learn to kind of go with the pace that we feel comfortable with, and not feel afraid to reach out to other people, to ask for advice, to ask for support, pretty much like we would if we were to start a job, and we would be like, hey, this is the first time I'm navigating this, like, hey, can you like tell me what's a good way to think about this, what's a good way to approach this, what should I be doing, like how should I be thinking about this. So to not feel quiet and not feel stuck in their experience, but be able to ask for help. And I think part two of this is to start developing some comfort with the idea that the other person is not perfect. So just as we're not perfect, the other person's not perfect and is going to bring their flaws with them. So if we can roll with that, as opposed to trying to make it really, trying to change the other person or trying to perfect them in some way so that they fit our mold, we can get caught up in all kinds of cycles doing that. So understanding that the other person is not perfect and understanding what our values are, the things that are really, really important to us, so that as we navigate the relationship, we can be aware of whether those are things that we're bumping up against, and are those things that are really important to us and are worth sticking our guns on, or are they things that we need to kind of maybe loosen up or be more flexible on and be more willing to go with the flow.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so important to realize as well, and not always looking for like perfectionism in a sense. So another question is, what are some of those values that you think that a lot of the times we should be looking for, but we're not looking for, are like those common sorts of mistakes and things that, you know, we should be more vigilant about when it comes to relationships, especially like healthy relationships.
Yeah. So I think this has to be, it'll certainly be different for different people because there is no, there's no prescription for what value works for you.
Yeah.
So I think that for different people, this will look different. And so it just means that we have to do that examination, that reflection, that introspection about what are the things that are really important to me? What are the experiences that I've had that have brought me to this place where I value certain things and I prioritize certain things over certain other things. And then be curious about that and be willing to have a conversation about that with other people in terms of, hey, this is like something that I think is really important. Like, how do you think about this? Or what are your views? Because oftentimes we can get stuck in the way we think about things and we don't really have experience and we don't have knowledge and we don't have the vocabulary to be able to understand whether those are really things that we should be paying attention to, whether we're missing something, right?
Hmm.
So again, going back to that employment example that I gave you, it's like you're going for your interview and it's like, okay, what are the things that I should be thinking about? Am I missing something? I was going to ask these questions. Are there other questions I should be thinking about? So
Yeah.
keeping in mind that being open-minded here is really key, and including other people in the conversation can help you figure out what are your values and what are the things that are really important to you.
So where do you learn all this stuff when it comes to relationships? Where do you get all of that information?
I wish that when we were born, like there'd be here's a handbook for getting through your toddlerhood, and here's a handbook
Right.
for how to make it through infancy, and here's a handbook for making. So I think oftentimes there is no place really to go and learn this. I think it's our curiosity and also our experiences, right? A lot of us learn through our experiences. We go through like a few bad relationships and we're like, okay, never doing that again. Not, and you're never gonna date someone who does this, or never date someone who is XYZ. So
Right.
experience can teach you a lot, but that is a very expensive way to learn. And
Yeah.
so we want to, I think the more we can kind of learn from other people vicariously as well, that's
Hmm.
also a good way of knowing, so and so's going through this and that's their experience. How would I deal with that situation? Like, what would I be comfortable in that? Would I be willing to tolerate that? Would I be willing to put up with that? Would I be okay with that? Or would that be something that I could be flexible on? That's not such a deal breaker for me.
Right. Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really nice way of putting it as well, because you did say like experience is important, but then experience can be costly. It's a lot. So that's really true. And I think in general we should have more dialogue about relationships so people can learn from each other. And as you said
Yes.
earlier, with like stigmas and in the South Asian community, you're not necessarily allowed to go to prom or date and all of that. So you don't really have those conversations oftentimes too. So super important, and it's good to know that as well. um, and then another question is just about advocacy and empowering yourself in a relationship, and how are you able to do that and stand for your values and not, you know, be a passive person in these sorts of relationships and situations?
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with someone today, and they were talking about how it's so important to be liked, and it's so important to feel needed by other people, and it's so important to feel appreciated by other people, and it's so important to feel respected by other people. And
Mm-hmm.
while all of those things are really great and fantastic, it's really none of our business what other people think about us,
Right.
right? And I say this in the best way possible because I think we can expend a lot of time, effort, and energy trying to manage and control other people's opinions about us as if that's something that we have control of from the get go. That's certainly not something we can control. And when we get invested in that, then we kind of lose sight of what's really important, which is like our voice and what's
Right.
important to us. And we become more about what they want to see and what they want to hear and what they appreciate. So we lose ourselves in the process. And that can be a very dangerous process because then we're living for other people's validation,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And in some ways we're also being inauthentic because then who other people want to see and appreciate and value might not be who we are and how we want to show up. And
Mhm.
when there is that gap between who we are and what other people want to be, we're always going to be chronically dissatisfied.
Right.
So I think it's important to kind of know that if you have a tendency to be a little bit of a people pleaser, if you have a tendency to be a little bit more concerned about other people's reactions and other people's perceptions of you, that you might want to dim that down a little bit and keep the focus back on um, what do I want and what's meaningful and important to me. And then other people's respect and validation needs to be a byproduct. That's
Mhm.
not the main thing that we're driving towards, right? Our bus has to go towards what is important, meaningful to us. And then if other people love and appreciate that, fantastic, right? That makes our job so much easier. But if they don't, then that'll be fine too,
Right. Yeah.
because you'll always find your people. You'll always find people who value and appreciate you for who you are, for what you bring to the table,
Mhm.
and how you're showing up.
I think that's just so important to know because I think especially at a younger age, you think that, this is a small bubble that you're in, especially during COVID, because you're talking to the same people.
Yeah.
And then knowing that like you'll find something, like it won't, this isn't all the people that this isn't it. Like, I think that's just really important to know as well. And yeah, I think it's a common thing I've seen with a lot of people is just losing your sense of individuality and who you are when it comes to these things, just because it's like all new and you also still figuring yourself out, especially as an undergrad. For me, it's like I'm still learning who I am, and then it's like you're adding something else into the picture. It's like you're still figuring out this one thing, so how are you able to figure out all of that?
Yeah,
uh,
which is why it's also important to go, like, especially in your early relationships, it's also important to go a little slow,
yeah.
right? To take the time to get to know the other person, to take the time to get to know yourself, to not rush into intimacy, to not, and I'm not just talking about physical intimacy, but even emotional intimacy.
Right.
That's not something that needs to be rushed through just to kind of have fun and get the experience, but to really take it slow, because that's when you will truly get to know the other person, and the other
Mhm.
person will get the chance to know you, and then you also have the opportunity to step off. It's like a train, like you at any point will be able to step off. If your train is running on local, if it's running on express, then you're headed in a direction, and then good luck
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to get off a running train.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's also super true with like the whole like, speed of things and taking your time. That's a really valuable thing. I think like I definitely think that's really important to note as well. And so what is the key to maintaining good mental health when it comes to a relationship? Let's say things are going too fast. Like how do you slow them down and, make sure that, your mental health and you are like doing just fine and all of that?
Yeah. I think it can be very confusing, because part of being involved with someone else is like it's so exhilarating to be
Right.
connected to someone else, especially if it's early on in the relationship. It's almost like being sometimes people describe it like it's almost like being on like a substance, right? Like they are so addicted to the other person, like it's all about the other person. It's so easy to be
Right.
seduced by the other person,
Yeah.
and get like swept away in that experience and that feeling.
Hmm.
And I think at the same time, it's really, really important, if that's happening to you, where you feel like you are so drawn into the other person that it's becoming so much about who they are and what's happening, and it's just the two of you, right? It's important to find some ways to get some alone time and center yourself and
Yes.
figure out that we don't have to be joined at the hip all the time. That some part of this can also be me keeping my interests, my hobbies, my passions, the things that I like doing, so that I can keep maintaining a sense of healthy interest in
Right.
myself and the things that are important to me, while still being connected to this other person who means so much to me, right? So
Yeah.
we don't want our lives to become swept away or drawn away by somebody else. We want to be able to understand what's important to us, what's meaningful to us, and
Mhm.
at the same time figure out, okay, how does this fit in with this other person in my life, and how does this fit in with where I see things going, and does it work, does it not work? Like, we all those things are very important conversations to have with ourselves.
Right. Yeah, no, I definitely think space is so important and sometimes it's taken in such a negative context that you're not able to do that, but that's a really important way of standing up for yourself and having that time for yourself, and taking that space and having that, healthy time balance. And what you said about addiction, I remember I was looking this up, like the biological background of this, and with all like the hormones and things like that, after you're out of something like a relationship, you do suffer like these like biological and physiological symptoms of withdrawal as well. So it's definitely very true. And so I think these are so important lessons to learn for relationships. And I think oftentimes, as what we've seen in the South Asian community with women, is you don't necessarily take that time and that space for yourself, or like learn to have that sort of advocacy. And I think that's really important to like practice standing up and getting that time and that space and whatever you need to develop as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I think also what happens with us as South Asian women is that we don't necessarily have the role models in our parents
Right.
that imbibe that same value. I
Mm-hmm.
think that traditionally the role of mom and woman has been very much about putting myself on back burner and taking care of everybody else before I take care of myself.
Yeah.
And so that often also means like being very enmeshed in the family system, right? Where there are no boundaries between, okay, this is mom, this is what she does, this is who she is, this is what she likes, what she doesn't like. A mom wife can become very like almost boundaryless. It's like she pervades the entire system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a culture, considering like Indian culture, it can sometimes be a little bit more pushy towards women taking a step back,
Right.
and almost reinforcing that we should take a step back, that it is important that you be there to support your husband, and he's the primary breadwinner, and it's important to kind of be there and always loom in the background and let him
Mm-hmm.
take center stage over family and life and work and everything else. So I mean, growing up with models that don't show you that it's important to be able to take time for yourself. It's important to have healthy boundaries between how you spend your time and how you spend time with other people. All of those things can also influence our choices and our decisions, right?
Right.
Because then that seems like the natural, that seems like the thing to do. That seems like the typical prescribed way to be, which is to lose yourself in the other person. And I
Right.
think what we're trying to teach young women, especially South Asian women, is that understand the patterns that are healthy, because there are a lot of things about Indian culture and the role of women in Indian culture that are healthy, but also
Mm-hmm.
understand the patterns that are not healthy and try and move towards either changing those or changing yourself so that you don't fall in the same mindset.
And yeah, I think you're right about the whole role models, like what we see at our homes and like in our families, as well as even what's portrayed in pop culture. I think
Yeah.
commonly we look at Bollywood movies and all of that for like how are relationships, how does love, all of that work. But that's also a pretty not good example. So I think that's a really valid point as well. And just making sure, I think the media you consume as well as what you see, having that in the back of your mind that this isn't necessarily what it should look like. And I guess another question is just, you mentioned some South Asian, like very specifically, like healthy patterns that you see in a lot of South Asian households versus non unhealthy patterns. What are some of those things, the common things that you see?
Yeah. So I think that our culture tends to value a lot of conformity and obedience.
Right.
And I think this is partly true of collective cultures in general, where it's important for everybody to kind of fit in. It's important to not break the mold. It's important to do as we're told. And that's something that's reinforced like right from the time when we're in school in India, is that this is the way it is. You just have to follow it. Don't question it.
Right.
This is it. These are the rules. This is the framework, and you have to live within this. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what this sometimes does for a lot of people is it breaks the spirit of independent thinking, and it breaks the spirit of, but why do we have to do this? Why is this important? Does this work for me, or
Mm-hmm.
is this just something that works for, is like a prescriptive norm in terms of how I need to be? But if I think differently, or
Mm-hmm.
if my needs are different, how am I going to make that work? So
Right.
what that ends up doing is, and I think that it's one of the unsaid, unwritten rules about our culture is that this also gets passed down, where parents also expect, Indian parents and South Asian parents also expect their kids to be more, don't reply back, don't question, just do as you're told.
Right.
And so I think that creates this sense of, I need to kind of go with the flow. I need to do what other people ask me to do.
Mm-hmm.
I need to not question things, think things. Other people can choose what's good for me. I don't get to choose what's good for me, what works for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I developed this way of being in the world that's centered around other people, their thought, what they value, as opposed to who am I, what's important to me, and what is my unique contribution to the world. How am I separate from other people? And so
Right.
this often brings up like a lot of issues with, like I mentioned before, people pleasing for sure, but also having a very strong inner critic, which is, we can be very, very judgmental about ourselves because we're constantly trying to keep things, at bay, in terms of everything needs to be good, or at least things need to appear to be good.
Right.
Even if things aren't good, as long as we're keeping the appearance going of things being good, we're okay.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where things can get really tricky, because we can often ourselves be confused that things are good when they're no longer good, just because we're keeping up the appearances.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely think that's so important. I think I know I've seen this instilled within myself too. It's like, oh, I'm just going with the flow, but it's like, yeah, you can do that, but also just you also having that sort of mindset to understand what exactly is happening and not, um, going off with something. I think another mindset that I've seen very common is like, even if things are going badly, it's like, don't give up. Like, it's your responsibility to fix things when it's not
Yeah.
always like, that's not always what's gonna like work out in the end. So,
Yes, and that's I think most commonly that's also put on women,
yeah.
where it's if you have any disgruntlements or disagreements, like, put them aside for the benefit, the good of the larger family, right?
Right.
Like, you're, so again, like, reinforcing this idea that your needs are not good enough, or it's your job to now keep everybody together and keep everything going. Like, you're the go-to person for everything, and you have to make sure that you are doing everything to keep everything going. And it's a lot of pressure. It's a lot
Right.
of pressure, and it's not necessarily something that women are signing up for.
Hmm.
And so we have to be careful sometimes, because we ourselves take that on without someone assigning that role to us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, that's so true. And I think that's just really important. I think to even notice that. I don't think that's something that I've noticed in like about like relationships in general. And then that it is very true, like where you need to make sure that you're not the only person taking that sort of burden, and it's not just a woman's job or place to do things like that. And just going off of like some of the questions that were asked through our story as well, what is just relationship advocacy?
Yeah. So relationship advocacy is really knowing and understanding the boundaries between a healthy and unhealthy relationship. And when
Mm-hmm.
the relationship is going into a place that is not for the benefit of the people involved, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this means knowing, and especially I think this is true for people who are new to dating, but certainly for people who are in the age spectrum where, unhealthy, toxic relationships exist. That's just the reality of life.
Yeah.
And we don't always know what those signs are, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
always know what unhealthy relationships look like. Sometimes we've never been in a healthy relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's the only thing we have been in, so that's the only thing that we know and are familiar with, and so that's the thing that we then get drawn to. But it means being able to educate ourselves about what are the signs of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, and also now digital abuse, right? Because there are
Right.
ways in which someone can be controlling of us, and digital technology in a way that's very harmful to us. And so
Right.
being able to understand that then empowers us to be able to stand up for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and also be able to stand up for other people who may not be aware that they're in that situation where they are, being manipulated or being harassed or being taken advantage of. So
Yeah.
I think it's important, because it's, I'm also a great believer that women have to empower other women, that
Mm-hmm.
we cannot leave it to anybody else to help us. Sorry for the background noise of my dog. But
Uh-huh.
we cannot leave it to other people to support ourselves. That
Yeah.
at the very least, we have to be there for one another. We have to find our sisterhood. We have to find our community and
Hmm.
be there for other women, so that we can be that voice that can reach out to them and say, hey, I see you're struggling. Do you need help? Is there anything that I could do?
Yeah.
Or these are the things that I know, or these are the resources I have. Would you like me to share them with you?
Yeah.
So in that sense, knowing about what constitutes as a healthy relationship and what is now teetering on the verge of being unhealthy can
Hmm.
help us be there for ourselves, but also be there for other people.
I think that's such an important point as well with women supporting women. And a couple of questions that we actually got from our followers were regarding the relationships that occur not with like not romantic relationships, but between a mother and mother-in-law and a woman. So one of the questions was, how do you balance boundaries and rebuild sorts of relationships with toxic or narcissistic in-laws or anything like that?
So I think, even though we marry into a family, right? And this is something that we always say in our culture, is that you're not just marrying a person, you're also marrying their family. So
Hmm.
unfortunately, what this ends up meaning is that you also have a whole host of other characters that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
And it kind of firstly behooves us to have a good standing of who we are.
Hmm.
Because if we know who we are and what we're comfortable and we're not comfortable with, when certain things happen or when certain behaviors take place, it's easy for us to say, I'm not okay with that, or
Hmm.
that rubbed me the wrong way, or that didn't feel good to me, or that didn't feel kind to me.
Yeah.
The problem is when we don't even realize when that's happening, when it's insidiously happening. And sometimes these experiences can be, they don't have to be blatant experiences. They can be just very, very short, like little pokes. But
Right.
over time, when we've accumulated so many of them, it can get to a breaking point.
Hmm.
And not only that, I think then it helps us to understand what we're okay with and what we're not okay with. And then being able to get, I think, the love and support of our spouse to be able to be on the same page as us,
Hmm.
not expecting them to advocate for us. I think we
Yeah.
still have to learn to advocate for ourselves and
Hmm.
be okay with not being liked. Because I think this is another trap that we fall into, is that we want to be liked by our in-laws, and we want to be liked by everybody. That's the reality of life.
Yeah.
But I think it can feel particularly hurtful to be rejected by someone who you really love, right?
Hmm.
And their family not reciprocating the same. And at the
Right.
same time, it's important for your self-dignity, it's important for your self-confidence to
Yeah.
be able to put up those little flags that say, this is not okay, or I'm not okay with it. How am I going to create some emotional distance or physical distance between me and the other person, so that I'm not always finding myself on the side where I feel hurt or disrespected or embarrassed or humiliated, the
Hmm.
whole range of experiences that we can sometimes experience.
Right. No, yeah, and I think especially when it comes to specifically like a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship, we see in especially Indian pop culture with all I've seen a lot of like Hindi serials where it's like a very normalized thing, like, oh, they hate each other, they're always going to clash with each other, and do you is that normalized? Do you see that being normalized still, or do you think things have changed and that's just what's being portrayed on TV?
I think that for some women, there's definitely a sense of needing to break that narrative and
Right.
not feel like this is how we need to define our relationships, is based on the Saas Bahu episodes that you can watch endlessly on binge watch on TV.
Hmm.
So, and I think it takes really empowered women to be able to say, this is not the legacy that I want in my family,
Hmm.
right? Because if this is something that I endured, does not mean that this is something I have to pass on,
Yeah.
right? Or because these are my experiences, or this is something that I was taught, does not necessarily, or learned, right? Because sometimes we're not taught things, but we learn things as we go. Just
Hmm.
because I learned things, or just because I saw things from that perspective, does not mean that I have to keep holding on to this way of being with another generation, right? Someone
Yeah.
who's actually meant to be there to support my child and take care of them and be with them. What is the point and purpose in having an acrimonious relationship with that person?
Hmm.
So it means that as mother-in-laws, we have to step up in terms of empowering ourselves and
Yeah.
educating ourselves. And it
Mhm.
also means that we have to understand that when we welcome someone into the family, this is, another human being, and they're going to have their own wants and their own needs and their own desires, that they're not a Lego piece that you can just kind of, plug into your existing Lego.
Right.
So if we come at it with that understanding, then we can be more open-minded about disagreements, because disagreements are going to happen, and relationships are, there's always going to be disagreements in relationships, and there's always going to be points of misunderstanding and conflict. But
Right.
then if we have that basic understanding in place, we're more amenable to try and fix it, as opposed to hold it as a battleground, that that this is my domain and this is your domain, and never can the two kind of coincide. And I
Yeah.
think it's the same is true for young women, as they're kind of moving into the space of understanding themselves, to be able to identify if there are things that are happening that are, that they're tricky or having difficulty navigating with. How is this a way that we can talk about this, so that we're not ignoring them, we're not putting our needs aside and then feeling neglected or abused by other people.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's just so important. And I had a thought about this and then I just slipped my head, but I think yeah, just another question that I had from the audience in general was, how do you balance these South Asian values that are instilled with us versus our own assertiveness with and personality with in-laws, and even just relationships in general with our partners or anything like that?
Yeah. I think sometimes we have to recognize that there are lots of good elements of like our culture, and there are a lot of things that we have learned and that we can hold on to, that move us in the right direction.
Yeah.
And also there can be elements of our culture that might hold us back, that might make us feel less than, or that might make us feel like we deserve to be left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we are mindful of those things and the things that are important to us, then we can have more open conversations about, these are things that work and they're important, but our whole identity is not defined by our culture. Right? To
Mm-hmm.
some extent, we have to move away from this idea and see ourselves as global citizens, which is, these might be my roots and they're very important because they identify where I come from, but they don't have to completely define who I am and how I live my life.
Yeah.
Right? And that I'm allowed to be a growing human being that can question, that can contradict, that can be okay with certain things and not be okay with certain things, and be willing to leave certain things behind.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, that it's not a all or nothing kind of, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of approach, that it can be picking and choosing, right? The things that are helpful, meaningful, purposeful, and leaving behind the things that don't serve us.
Definitely. And I just remember the thought that I had. You reminded me with the whole the puzzle piece thing. There was, I don't know if you saw the show Indian Matchmaking, but one of the
Mm.
things that really stood out was when this mother-in-law was like, I want a daughter-in-law who's flexible. And it was just like, what is this that yeah. So that's so true. Like, we shouldn't have to mold ourselves to fit some certain standard in a relationship. Like, you should be, you're perfect the way you are. And same with the other person. And I think that's just an important thing to note as well.
Yes,
And
but
yeah.
just a note about that is that sometimes we can get like very stuck with, I'm fine just the way I am and I don't need
Yeah.
to change. And
Yeah.
I think that's also a tricky place to be. So I think the balance is, we don't have to be shape shifting where we're constantly trying to be what someone else wants us to be, and we don't have to be so set in stone that this is who I am and never can I change. I
Right.
think that the idea is also that as we have experiences and as we grow and as we take feedback from other people, we keep changing and growing that sense of, okay, this is who I am, and today I'm allowed to be this, and tomorrow I'm allowed to be something else. If tomorrow I learn, as we learn new information, we are
Hmm.
allowed to change who we are. We don't always have to keep doing something just because we've been doing it for so long. Right?
Right.
So I think that's important to understand, is if a lot of people are giving us feedback about a certain topic or a subject, it's
Yeah.
important to pay attention and not hold our ground that this is who I am and that's it.
Yeah. 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 No, I 100% agree. I think there's always a fine balance of like changing too much and not changing at all. And we always have to strike that balance. And it's just all about self improvement at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. And one of the last questions that I have is just how do you empower yourself to have these sorts of difficult conversations with yourself and with other people regarding relationships?
So I think that if we can remember, sorry, my dog is giving me a really hard time today.
Yeah.
If we can remind ourselves that at the end of the day, we're answerable to ourselves, that, you know, other people's opinions about us and how other people think about us is important. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to stand by the choices and decisions that we make.
Right.
So when it comes to empowering ourselves, it's really important to think about what is the cost? What is the cost of keeping quiet? What is the cost of not saying something? And
Yeah.
by cost, I mean not just the short-term cost, but how is this going to impact me in the long run? How am I going to feel about not saying something about this? How am I going to feel about being able to keep quiet about this? So I think empowering ourselves means reminding ourselves that there is a cost to staying quiet,
Yeah.
that there is a certain price that has to be paid, whether that's a price to our self-esteem, our self-confidence, or the quality of the relationships that we have with other people. And using that as a way to also then get support from other people and learn from other people, right?
Yeah.
Like we're certainly not the first person who's encountered this problem, and we will not be the last. So
Yeah.
having a community of people who you can reach out to and who you can have these kinds of conversations with, where you're like, you know, this is what I'm thinking about, and I'm wondering how people have navigated, right? Like things like this.
Yeah.
And maybe it's someone you trust in your family that you can speak to. Maybe it's not always your mom. Maybe it's an aunt. Maybe it's somebody else you trust. Or maybe it's a friend whose opinion you trust. Someone you look up to, whom you can kind of share that with, and try and figure out like what are some things to think about, what might be some things I'm missing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, thank you. And I think that that's really important to know. And just in general, this conversation, I've gotten so many major takeaways from it. And I think it's just so important to empower yourself and put yourself in these positions where you're able to voice what you want. I think that's the main thing with the relationship as well. And so thank you so much for this conversation. And I really enjoyed it. Let me know if anyone else has any questions in the live or in the stories. You can definitely send it on our DMs or anything like that. But thank you for this conversation, Dr. Singh, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and really enjoyed being here. And yeah, please feel free to DM me or message me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that weren't answered here.
All right, yeah, thank you. And yeah, definitely check out Therapy for Brown Women. Amazing page, and the work that Dr. Singh does is amazing as well. So thank you again for being here, and bye.
Bye.